July 18, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy stood like green fortresses, each one hiding death in shadow. Sergeant Michael Cordova gripped the handles of his Browning machine gun, sweat cutting rivers through the dust on his face. Above him, the sky belonged to someone else. For 3 weeks since the beaches, the men of the Third Army had pushed inland through hell measured in yards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Every field was a killing ground. Every stone wall concealed a sniper. Every road became a graveyard when the sound arrived. That sound, a mechanical roar that turned stomachs to ice and sent infantry scrambling for ditches. It was the growl of a Panzer Mark VI, the Tiger, rolling forward with the inevitability of an avalanche. 60 tons of sloped armor and an 88mm gun that could vaporize a Sherman tank from a mile away. The Wehrmacht called it Königstiger when they wanted to sound regal. The SS crews called it their Iron Fist. American soldiers called it something else entirely. They called it the Reaper. On this particular morning in the Norman countryside, Cordova heard that growl echoing from beyond a tree line. His lieutenant, a man named Patterson, who still had the clean jaw of someone who believed war had rules, stared toward the sound with the kind of fear that no training manual prepared you for. The Sherman tanks in their column had already begun reversing, their commanders knowing what every veteran knew: in a straight fight, the Tiger did not lose. It hunted, it killed, it moved on. But on this morning, something else was coming. Something the Germans had not accounted for. High above the hedgerows, where the clouds broke into patches of summer blue, a different kind of thunder was building. The doctrine that brought American forces to Normandy was built on a simple belief: control the ground and you control the war. Tanks were the spearhead of that control, infantry the occupation force, and air power was supposed to soften targets before boots ever hit dirt. It was a philosophy written in staff colleges, refined in North African campaigns, and executed with the confidence of a nation that had never lost a war on its own soil. But Normandy was teaching a different lesson. The hedgerows, those ancient agricultural boundaries that crisscrossed the French countryside, turned every advantage into a liability. Tanks could not maneuver. Infantry could not see more than 30 yards ahead. Artillery could not target what it could not locate. And into this maze of green confusion, the Wehrmacht had deployed its most terrifying pieces. The Tiger tank was not merely a vehicle, it was a philosophy unto itself. German engineers had looked at the evolution of armored warfare and decided that protection and firepower mattered more than speed or numbers. They built a machine that could absorb punishment and deliver devastation. Its frontal armor was 4 inches thick, sloped to deflect even the most powerful Allied shells. Its 88mm Colt K-36 gun was adapted from anti-aircraft cannons, capable of punching through any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was suicide. A single Tiger could hold a road, a village, a bridge, and make it impassable. Sergeant Michael Cordova had seen his first Tiger 3 days after landing at Omaha Beach. His unit, part of the infantry advance supporting armored columns, had been moving through a village called Saint-Côme-du-Mont when the air split apart. The noise was not an explosion, it was something sharper, faster, a crack that felt like reality itself had broken. 50 yards ahead, a Sherman erupted. The turret spun through the air like a child's toy tossed in anger, trailing fire and black smoke. The crew never had a chance to scream. Cordova hit the ground so hard his teeth rattled. Around him men were shouting, scattering, trying to find cover that did not exist. The Tiger had fired from a position nearly 800 yards away, concealed behind the ruins of a stone barn. By the time the American column realized where the shot had come from, 2 more Shermans were burning. The Tiger reversed into the shadows and disappeared. That night, Cordova sat with his back against a wall that still smelled like fresh plaster and old wine. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette. Across from him, a tank commander named D'Angelo stared into nothing, his face smeared with yew and ash. D'Angelo had been inside one of the Shermans that survived. He spoke in a voice scraped hollow. "We hit it 3 times. Dead center. Saw the shells bounce off like we were throwing rocks. Then it turned its gun on us and my driver punched it. We bailed before it fired. Tommy stayed on the radio too long. They found his dog tags in the dirt." The American Armor Corps had entered the war with the M4 Sherman, a tank that was everything a democracy could want. It was reliable, easy to produce, simple to repair, and available in staggering numbers. American factories could churn out Shermans faster than Germany could build anything. The logic was industrial, quantity had a quality all its own. If the Germans had better tanks, America would drown them in volume. But volume meant nothing when your shells could not penetrate and theirs could cut through you like paper. The Sherman's 75mm gun was adequate against most German armor. Against the Tiger, it was a joke. Crews developed grim superstitions. Some painted extra stars on their hulls, believing it might confuse German gunners. Others welded spare track links onto the front armor, hoping the added metal might stop a shell. It never did. Some men refused to ride in the bow gunner position, knowing it was a death trap if the tank was hit. Others refused to be the loader, trapped inside a turret that could become a furnace in seconds. And yet they climbed in every morning, started the engines, and rolled forward because the mission demanded it, and because leaving your brothers behind was unthinkable. The Tiger was not invincible. German commanders knew its weaknesses intimately. It was slow, mechanically temperamental, and consumed fuel at a rate that made long advances impossible. Its weight made it difficult to transport and lethal to bridge crossings. A well-placed mine could cripple it. A flanking maneuver by fast tanks could exploit its thin side armor. But in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of Normandy, those weaknesses became irrelevant. The Tiger did not need speed. It needed only a concealed position and a clear line of fire. It did not need fuel efficiency when it could dominate a single crossroad for hours. The hedgerows funneled Allied armor into predictable paths, and every path became a shooting gallery. American commanders tried to adapt. They called in artillery strikes, but the Tigers moved before the shells arrived. They used infantry scouts to locate enemy armor, but the Tigers were protected by veteran Panzer grenadiers who cut down exposed soldiers without hesitation. They tried massed assaults, throwing 5 or 6 Shermans at a single Tiger, hoping that one might survive long enough to flank it. Sometimes it worked. Most times it left burned hulls and dead men scattered across fields that French farmers would plow around for generations. Sergeant Cordova learned to read the battlefield by sound. The snap of a German MG-42 machine gun, so fast it sounded like tearing cloth, meant stay low and move only when it paused to reload. The whistle of an incoming mortar shell meant you had 2 seconds to decide whether to run or pray. And the grinding diesel roar of a Tiger meant you found a hole, any hole, and you made peace with whatever god you killed. But there was another sound beginning to filter into the chaos of Normandy. It started as a distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard, building into a rumble that made men look up instead of down. It was the sound of radial engines, 9 cylinders each, mounted on aircraft that weighed 7 tons and carried enough ordnance to level a city block. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was coming to war, and it was about to rewrite every rule. The P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be a tank killer. It was designed as a high-altitude escort fighter, built to protect American bombers on their daylight raids deep into Germany. With a massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, the Thunderbolt could climb to 30,000 feet and fight Luftwaffe interceptors in the thin cold air where wars were decided by speed and firepower. It was big for a fighter, almost comically so. Pilots called it the Jug, because its fuselage was shaped like a milk bottle, wide and heavy. It was not graceful like the Spitfire or sleek like the Mustang, but it was tough. The radial engine could absorb punishment that would down any inline engine. The cockpit was surrounded by armor plating. Pilots who limped home with half a wing shot off and an engine trailing smoke swore by the Thunderbolt's ability to take damage and keep flying. But as the war evolved, so did the mission. By the summer of 1944, Allied air superiority over Europe was nearly absolute. The Luftwaffe had been bled dry over the skies of Germany, its experienced pilots dead, its fuel reserves dwindling. The P-47 squadrons found themselves with fewer aerial targets and a new question. What do you do with a fighter plane when there is nothing left to fight in the sky? The answer came from the ground. American commanders were desperate for any advantage against German armor. Traditional close air support involved bombers dropping payloads from altitude, hoping to hit targets that were often already gone by the time the bombs arrived. What if fighters, fast and maneuverable, could strike directly at enemy tanks? The concept was not new. The Soviets had used their Sturmovix as ground attack aircraft with brutal effectiveness on the Eastern Front. The British had experimented with Typhoons armed with rockets. But that dissolved the Spirty 7 and the P-47 could carry more ordnance than most light bombers. Engineers began experimenting. They mounted hardpoints under the wings capable of carrying bombs, 500-pounders that could crater roads and collapse buildings. They added rocket rails, allowing the Thunderbolt to carry high-velocity aerial rockets designed to punch through armor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And most crucially, they trained pilots in a new kind of warfare: low altitude, high speed, close quarters. Flying a fighter plane 50 feet off the ground at 300 miles per hour, hunting for targets that shot back with cannon fire and machine guns, required a different kind of courage. It was not the clinical detachment of high-altitude bombing. It was intimate, immediate, and lethal in both directions. Captain Raymond Archer was one of the pilots who learned this new trade. He had flown escort missions over Germany, had seen his friends die in fire and smoke at altitudes where the air was so cold your breath froze on the oxygen mask. He had shot down 3 German fighters and earned a reputation as a steady hand in a dogfight, but when his squadron was reassigned to ground attack duties in support of the Normandy breakout, Archer had to forget everything he knew about air combat. The first mission briefing was surreal. Instead of altitude charts and bomber formations, the intelligence officer pointed to maps marked with roads and villages. "Your targets are Tiger tanks reported in this sector. Approach from the west to avoid flak concentrations. Use rockets on the first pass, guns on the second if you survive that long. Expect ground fire from every direction. Do not linger." Archer raised his hand. "How do we identify a Tiger from altitude?" The intelligence officer shrugged. "It is the one that is bigger than everything else and usually has a bunch of burning Shermans around it." The room did not laugh. That night, Archer walked the flight line, running his hand along the cold metal of his Thunderbolt's wing. The ground crew had loaded 8 high-velocity aerial rockets under the wings, 4 per side. Each rocket was 60 pounds of propellant and explosive, designed to fly straight and fast, to hit hard enough to crack open fortified positions. In theory, they could penetrate tank armor. In theory, Archer had seen plenty of theories die in practice. The morning of July 18th, Archer's squadron lifted off from a temporary airstrip carved into a French field. The Thunderbolts climbed into the early light, their engines a chorus of mechanical thunder. There were 12 planes in the formation, each one loaded with rockets and ammunition. The mission was simple on paper. A Tiger tank had been reported holding a crossroads near the village of Saint-Denis-le-Gast. It had already destroyed 4 Shermans and was preventing the American advance. Ground forces had tried to flank it, but the terrain made maneuver impossible. Artillery had been called in, but the Tiger had moved after each barrage. Now it was the Air Corps' turn. As the formation descended toward the target area, Archer felt his pulse climb. This was different from dogfighting. In a dogfight, both sides were fast, maneuverable, dancing through the sky. This was flying into a fixed position that would see you coming, and would fill the air with steel. The hedgerows below looked peaceful from altitude, a patchwork of green fields and stone walls. Then the radio crackled. "Ground controller to Falcon leader, your target is marked with orange smoke. Repeat, orange smoke at the crossroads. You are cleared hot." Archer pushed the stick forward, and the Thunderbolt dropped like a hawk. The world compressed into a tunnel of speed and focus. Archer saw the crossroads, saw the orange smoke rising in lazy spirals, saw the dark shape of the Tiger parked in the shadow of a hedgerow. It looked impossibly small from this angle, a toy made of metal and menace. Then the flak started. Tracer rounds arced up from concealed positions, bright lines of death stitching through the air. Archer jinked left, then right, feeling the Thunderbolt shudder as shrapnel peppered the fuselage. The altimeter unwound. 500 feet, 400, 300. He could see details now. The Tiger's long barrel swiveling toward him. German infantry diving for cover. The burned hulk of a Sherman smoldering in a ditch. 200 feet. Archer pressed the trigger, and felt the Thunderbolt lurch as the first penny of rockets screamed off the rails. They left white contrails, twin spears of fire and smoke, racing toward the target faster than thought. He did not wait to see if they hit. He pulled up hard, the G-forces crushing him into the seat, the world spinning as he clawed for altitude. Behind him, the crossroads erupted. The rockets struck the Tiger not in the thick frontal armor, but on the engine deck, the vulnerable rear section where fuel and ammunition were stored. The explosion was not cinematic. It was brutal and final. The Tiger's turret lifted into the air on a pillar of fire, hung for an impossible moment, then crashed back down at an angle. Secondary explosions tore through the hull as ammunition cooked off. Black smoke boiled into the sky. Archer leveled out at 1,000 feet, his hands shaking on the stick. His wingman's voice crackled over the radio. Falcon leader confirmed target destroyed. Archer looked back. The Tiger was a burning wreck, flames consuming what had been the most feared weapon on the battlefield. Around it he could see American infantry emerging from cover, moving forward, reclaiming ground that had been impassable minutes before. He keyed the radio, target confirmed destroyed. Returning to base, the flight back was silent. Archer's mind was racing, replaying the dive, the flak, the moment of impact. He had expected to feel triumph. Instead he felt something closer to awe. They had killed a Tiger, from the air. With rockets, it should not have worked. The armor was too thick, the target too small, the odds too long, but it had worked. And if it worked once, it could work again. The success of that mission rippled through command structures faster than any official report. Within days, every Air Corps squadron in the theater was being retrained for ground attack. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once a high-altitude guardian, became a low-altitude hunter. Pilots learned to identify targets by silhouette, to judge distance and angle in the split second before firing. They learned to read the terrain, to use hills and tree lines as cover, to strike from the direction of the sun so German gunners would be blinded. They learned to fear flak more than enemy fighters because flak did not miss and did not run out of ammunition. And they learned that every mission was a coin flip between coming home with a kill and not coming home at all. Ground crews worked 20-hour days, loading rockets, patching bullet holes, replacing engines damaged by ground fire. Armorers painted kill marks on the fuselages, small silhouettes of tanks for every confirmed destruction. Some Thunderbolts accumulated dozens, some never made it past their first mission. For the German tank crews, the change was incomprehensible at first. They had owned the battlefield, their Tigers had been untouchable, their training superior, their tactics refined through years of war on the Eastern Front. Then the sky began to kill them. The first crews to be hit by rocket attacks did not understand what had happened. One moment they were advancing, the next their tank was a furnace, and they were burning alive. Survivors spoke of a sound, a high-pitched scream that gave no warning, followed by impact and fire. They could not shoot back at something moving 300 miles per hour. They could not hide when the enemy could see the entire battlefield from above. Panic spread through the panzer divisions. Crews began abandoning their Tigers at the first sound of aircraft engines, running for tree lines and ditches, preferring to face infantry than to burn. German commanders issued new orders. Tanks were to move only at night. Daylight advances were suicide. Camouflage became obsessive, every vehicle draped in netting and foliage, parked under trees whenever possible. But the Thunderbolts adapted. They flew lower, slower, hunting in pairs, one plane drawing fire while the other struck. They learned to recognize the heat signature of an engine that had been running recently. They coordinated with ground forces, who marked targets with smoke and directed strikes by radio. Sergeant Michael Cordova watched the transformation from the ground. One afternoon his unit was pinned down by a Panther tank, a slightly smaller cousin of the Tiger, but still lethal. They had been trapped in a farmhouse for 2 hours, unable to move without drawing fire. Then he heard it, the rumble of radial engines. He looked up and saw 2 Thunderbolts coming in low, so low he could see the rockets under their wings. The Panther's crew heard them too. They tried to reverse, to get back into the cover of the hedgerow. Too late, the first Thunderbolt fired. The rockets hit the Panther's side armor, the weakest point, and the tank shuddered like a living thing in pain. The second Thunderbolt followed, its machine guns ripping into the stricken vehicle, shredding vision ports and external equipment. The Panther stopped moving, smoke poured from the hatches. Cordova stood up slowly, watching as the Thunderbolts pulled away, waggling their wings in a gesture that felt almost playful. Around him, men were cheering, slapping each other's backs, shouting praise at the sky. For the first time since landing in Normandy, Cordova felt something other than fear. He felt hope. The Tigers were not invincible, the Germans could bleed, and the sky belonged to America. August 1944, the breakout from Normandy had begun, and with it came the largest test of air power against armor the world had ever seen. Operation Cobra unleashed thousands of aircraft against German positions, carpets of bombs that shattered defensive lines and turned roads into moonscapes. But it was not the heavy bombers that terrified German tank crews, it was the fighters. The Thunderbolts came in waves, hunting anything that moved on wheels or tracks. The Panzer divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, found themselves hunted like animals across the French countryside. Captain Raymond Archer had flown 16 ground attack missions by the time the breakout started. Each one had taught him something new about killing tanks from the air. He learned that the engine deck was always the weakest point, where armor was thinnest and fuel lines ran exposed. He learned that a Tiger trying to reverse into cover moved slowly enough to give you a second pass. He learned that hitting a tank with rockets was less about precision and more about saturation, firing all 8 at once and letting probability do the work. He also learned the cost. Of the 12 Thunderbolts that flew with him on that first mission in July, only 7 remained. 2 had been shot down by flak, 1 had crashed on landing after taking damage, 2 more had been transferred to other squadrons to fill gaps left by losses. War was arithmetic, and the numbers never balanced. The German response was desperate and innovative. Flak batteries were repositioned to protect every major road and crossroads. The feared 88mm guns, once reserved for tanks and bombers, were now pointed at low-flying fighters. Quad-mounted 20mm cannons created walls of fire that no aircraft could survive flying through. Some tank columns traveled with mobile flak platforms, half-tracks bristling with automatic cannons that could shred a Thunderbolt in seconds. Archer lost his wingman, a pilot named Foster, to one of those platforms. Foster had been lining up for a rocket run on a column of Panzer IVs when the flak vehicle opened fire. The Thunderbolt disintegrated in mid-air, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling through the smoke. There was no parachute. No time for last words over the radio. One moment Foster was there, the next he was gone, reduced to debris scattered across a field that would grow wheat again someday. But for every Thunderbolt lost, a dozen tanks burned. The mathematics of attrition favored the Americans now. Germany could not replace its armor. Every Tiger destroyed was a loss that could not be made good. The factories in the Ruhr were being bombed around the clock. Fuel supplies were dwindling. Trained crews were dying faster than new ones could be trained. Meanwhile, American factories churned out P-47s by the hundreds. Pilots rotated in from training schools in the States, eager and terrified in equal measure. Some lasted weeks, some lasted hours, but they kept coming, and the pressure never relented. Near the town of Morton, the Germans launched a desperate counterattack, trying to cut off the American advance and trap entire divisions. They committed their remaining armor reserves, including a battalion of Tigers that had been held in reserve for precisely this moment. The attack began at night, German columns moving under cover of darkness, their commanders hoping to achieve breakthrough before Allied air power could respond. At dawn, the weather was overcast, thick clouds hanging low over the battlefield. German officers breathed easier. Clouds meant no air support. Clouds meant the Tigers could operate freely. They were wrong. The Thunderbolts came anyway, dropping below the cloud deck, flying at altitudes so low their propellers nearly kissed the treetops. Visibility was terrible. Rain streaked across cockpit canopies, but the pilots had learned to navigate by landmarks, by the shape of roads and rivers, by the smoke rising from burning vehicles. Archer led a flight of 4 through the murk, hunting for the reported Tiger battalion. They found it on a road east of Morton, a column of massive tanks grinding forward, their commanders confident that the weather had given them immunity. Archer did not hesitate. He rolled into a dive, his Thunderbolt screaming down through the gray air, and fired his rockets at the lead Tiger. The warhead struck the turret and engine simultaneously. The Tiger lurched, trailing fire, and ground to a halt. Behind it the column bunched up, tanks unable to pass the wreck blocking the narrow road. Archer's wingmen followed, each one selecting a target, each one firing. The road became a killing ground. Tigers burned, Panthers exploded, half-tracks tried to scatter into the fields and bogged down in mud. German crews bailed out, running for the ditches, abandoning millions of Reichsmarks worth of armor to save their lives. The counterattack at Morton collapsed. Without armor support, German infantry could not hold their positions. Within 48 hours, the entire offensive had been crushed, and the road to Germany lay open. Allied commanders studying the after-action reports found a startling figure. Over 70% of the German tanks destroyed during the battle had been killed from the air, not by bombs, not by artillery, by fighter aircraft armed with rockets, flown by men who had learned to turn the sky into a weapon. Sergeant Michael Cordova advanced through Morton with his unit days after the battle. The roads were lined with destroyed vehicles, Tigers and Panthers sitting at odd angles, their hulls punctured and burned. He stopped beside one Tiger, its turret blown completely off, and looked at the holes in the armor. They were not the neat punctures of tank shells, they were jagged tears, the signature of rockets detonating on impact. A tanker from a passing Sherman column walked over, shaking his head in something like reverence. Used to be we saw these things and ran. Now we see them and know somebody already did our job for us. Cordova nodded. He thought about the pilots flying overhead, about the math of it, about how many of them died to kill each tank. He thought about Foster and the others whose names he did not know, men who had climbed into their aircraft, knowing they might not come back, and did it anyway because the mission demanded it. War had no fair trades, only necessary ones. By September, the German army in France was in full retreat. The Thunderbolts pursued them across every mile, turning roads into graveyards, destroying convoys, hunting stragglers. German tank crews abandoned their vehicles rather than risk being caught in daylight. Mechanics sabotaged engines so tanks could not be recovered. Entire panzer divisions ceased to exist, their strength bled away not in grand battles, but in 1,000 small ambushes from above. The Tiger, once the symbol of German armored supremacy, became a liability. It was too slow to retreat quickly, too heavy to hide easily, too valuable to abandon but too vulnerable to save. Crews painted over the unit markings, trying to make their tanks less identifiable. They draped camouflage nets so thick the vehicles looked like moving haystacks. They traveled only at night, engines cold during the day, praying that the sound of radial engines would pass overhead without noticing them. Captain Archer flew his last combat mission in late September. His Thunderbolt had accumulated 43 tank kills, marked in neat rows on the fuselage. He had flown 87 missions, survived more flak than any man had a right to, and watched too many friends die. On that final flight, he escorted a formation of bombers back to England, flying high and easy, the way Thunderbolts were originally designed to fly. The sky was empty of enemies, the Luftwaffe had been broken. As he crossed the English Channel, Archer looked down at the water and thought about all the things he had learned. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. He had learned that technology was only as good as the men who wielded it. He had learned that wars were not won by single weapons or tactics, but by the league of 1,000 small advantages, pressed relentlessly until the enemy broke. And he had learned that the sky, which had once been a place of freedom and speed, could become a hunting ground as brutal as any battlefield on Earth. The legacy of the Thunderbolts' war against the Tiger was not written in grand proclamations or medals, though plenty of both were awarded. It was written in the quiet transformation of Bulls. Air support was an afterthought, a secondary mission for aircraft that could not fight in the sky. After Normandy, it became doctrine. Every major offensive from France to Germany included integrated air support, fighters working in direct coordination with ground forces, striking targets marked by forward observers, turning the battlefield into a seamless web of observation and destruction. The lessons learned over the hedgerows of Normandy were refined in the dash across France, perfected in the battles of the Bulge, and carried forward into the jet age. Modern close air support, the kind that saves infantry units and destroys enemy armor with precision strikes, traces its lineage directly back to those Thunderbolt pilots who learned to hunt tigers in the summer of 1944. For the men who fought on the ground, the change was simpler and more profound. Sergeant Michael Cordova made it all the way to Germany, survived the war and came home to a country that did not quite understand what he had seen. But he never forgot the sound of those radial engines, the sight of Thunderbolts diving out of the sun, the way hope felt when you were pinned down and certain you were about to die, and then the sky intervened. In his later years, he would tell his grandchildren about the war, about the fear and the cold and the friends he lost, and he would tell them about the pilots, men he never met, whose names he never learned, who flew into fire so that others might walk forward. That, he would say, was what it meant to fight together, to turn the sky itself into a shield. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.